Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Todman, and Deputy Administrator Fernandez. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for your willingness to serve. President Biden recently reached his 100th day in office, and so I think it's a good occasion to review what he promised and what he's been delivering. President Biden promised to be a unifier who would work across the aisle with both parties. Unfortunately, what he's delivered is a really partisan, classic tax and spend liberal agenda. He's pushed enormous spending plans to achieve the liberal wish list that he had, and he's proposing raising taxes in all sorts of ways, including undoing the 2017 tax reforms that helped create the best economy of my lifetime. Ms. Todman and Deputy Administrator Fernandez have been nominated for important leadership positions at two agencies, HUD and FTA, that both will play a central role in the administration's tax and spend plans. Let's consider housing first. After Congress just finished providing more than $80 billion for housing in response to COVID in 2020, that was on top of the $50 billion we annually spend on HUD programs alone, not to mention the billions that we spend on other housing programs. And then, of course, there's the tens of billions that we forego in tax revenue to subsidize housing in various ways. On top of all that, in this past March, the Biden administration pushed through an additional $32 billion for housing, purportedly in response to COVID. But the Democrats' March spending bill was not about providing COVID relief, and we know that because it made funding available for years after the expected end of the pandemic. For example, CBO estimates that none of the bill's $5 billion for HUD's homelessness assistance will even be spent in 2021. And that's not surprising since HUD has only spent a fraction of the money it was provided in the March 2020 CARES Act. In fact, as of this May, HUD has only spent 29% of these funds. But amazingly, the Biden administration is now proposing almost $250 billion more for housing in its so-called infrastructure bill, which is really mostly a multi-trillion-dollar expansion of the welfare state with a little bit of infrastructure sprinkled in. The administration wants Congress to spend $40 billion to upgrade public housing projects, places where people generally don't want to live. The Biden administration is also imposing burdensome housing regulations that will stifle economic growth. For example, the administration keeps extending a nationwide eviction moratorium that lacks both a legal basis and an economic justification. Just last week, a federal judge ruled that the moratorium is unlawful, and there's clearly no economic justification for it since Congress has allocated billions and billions of dollars in rental assistance, stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, all to ensure that people could pay their bills. But many small landlords will be harmed by this eviction moratorium, and maybe more importantly, it will make the housing supply less available and more expensive over time. Democrats have taken a similar approach to transit spending after Congress just finished providing more than $40 billion for transit in response to COVID in 2020, that on top of the $12 billion we annually spend on transit. This March, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats pushed through on a partisan basis an additional $30 billion for transit, purportedly in response to COVID. So that's a total of $82 billion that Congress spent on transit alone over the course of 1 year. You might wonder what the annual cost of operating all of the transit agencies in the U.S. combined adds up to. Well, in 2019, it was $54 billion. My colleagues try to justify the spending by saying that transit systems could collapse from declines in ridership and state and local government revenues, but ridership never dropped to zero, and ridership has increased significantly since the worst days of the pandemic last spring. And these systems are by definition local. They serve a city or maybe a metropolitan area. Should these local jurisdictions and states have any responsibility at all to pay for these systems? Evidently not, according to some of my colleagues. But remember, the fact is, on the whole, state and local tax collections set an all-time record high in 2020. And then on top of that, we sent them $500 billion for COVID relief. And then 2 months ago, the Democrat spending bill gave them yet another $350 billion. Now the Biden administration wants yet another $85 billion for transit as part of this really extraordinary spending binge. Now let's consider just one measure of how excessive this is. If we pass this Biden proposal, along with the FAST Act reauthorization, and we combine it with the $82 billion we provided just over the last year, we could have instead bought every transit commuter in America a $30,000 car. That's how much money we're spending. Given the billions that Democrats have spent and want to spend on housing and transit, I hope we'll hear from today's nominees about how they plan to protect taxpayer dollars, protect it from waste and misuse. Both HUD and FTA have important missions. HUD serves many low-income Americans. FTA supports public transportation services for millions of Americans. We just can't irresponsibly throw tens and hundreds of billions of dollars in these general directions without reform and oversight. As the Biden administration continues to consider an infrastructure package, it's my hope that it'll keep its focus on actual infrastructure and not simply an expansion of the welfare state as has been proposed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.